I ended up renting a house a few years ago because it solved two problems at once. My girlfriend lived about 20 minutes away, and my job was in the opposite direction. So moving there cut my commute almost in half and made it easier to see her during the week. It was an older house with a detached garage, a fenced backyard, and there was a concrete patio out back that looked like it had been poured by somebody who wasn't entirely sure what they were doing. The neighborhood was quiet, which was a big change from my previous apartment. Most evenings, I could sit outside and hear nothing but sprinklers running and dogs barking in the distance. My girlfriend spent a lot of time there from the beginning, and we had already started talking about her eventually moving in once her lease was up. I was slowly buying furniture that wasn't college apartment quality anymore. I planted herbs along the fence line. I hung shelves. It felt like I was settling into something more permanent. My neighbor. One day I happened to be carrying groceries in from my car and saw him standing on the sidewalk across the street. He was looking at the house. When I looked over at him, expecting him to notice me, he didn't react. I carried another load inside and came back out a minute later. He was still there. The weird part was that when he finally turned and walked away, he didn't look embarrassed the way people usually do when they're caught staring at something. He just casually headed back toward his property, like nothing had happened. I mentioned it to my girlfriend. She asked if he used to live there. I said maybe. We moved on. Over the next few weeks, I saw him occasionally. He lived across the street. I could usually see when he came and went. Most neighbors eventually do the little neighborhood greeting thing. This guy never did. The first few times I tried acknowledging him, he either ignored me completely or looked away before I finished waving. After a while, I stopped trying. One morning, I noticed him standing beside his mailbox. Again, he was looking toward my house. I remember shutting off the mower because I thought he wanted something. When I looked over, he immediately turned around and walked toward his front door. One evening, we were sitting in the living room watching television when she glanced out the front window and asked, "Who's that?" The guy was standing on the sidewalk again, just looking. She said he was one of those neighborhood watch types who didn't trust new people. That made sense to me. I figured he was protective of the area and suspicious of strangers. I had only lived there for a couple months at that point. Most creepy people at least give you some indication of what they're thinking. This guy always looked completely expressionless, like he was studying something. As summer went on, I saw him more often. Sometimes I'd leave for work and catch him standing in his driveway looking toward my property. Sometimes I'd come home and see him sitting in a folding chair beside his garage facing in my general direction. Every single time I noticed him looking, he'd eventually leave without saying anything. I never saw him talk to other neighbors either, at least not often. The neighborhood wasn't especially social, but people still interacted occasionally. He mostly kept to himself. One thing I did notice was that his house always seemed strangely dark, even at night. Most homes had lights visible through windows. His rarely did. I figured he preferred keeping the blinds closed. Again, none of this was enough to convince me something was wrong. It was just one of those things that sat in the back of my mind. Then one evening, I had spent part of the weekend reorganizing the garage and moving some potted plants around. A storm was supposed to come through later that night, and I remembered I had left a few smaller plants sitting near the back fence. The backyard had one motion light mounted above the rear door. I walked across the patio carrying a plastic storage bin because I planned to put some gardening supplies away while I was out there. I was halfway to the fence. Someone was running across the far side of my backyard. The figure moved fast, cutting between the fence and a row of bushes before disappearing through the side gate. The motion light wasn't strong enough to illuminate everything, but I recognized him. It was the neighbor. There was no question about it. I had seen him enough by then that I knew exactly who it was. I ran toward the gate and reached it just in time to hear it slam shut. By the time I got outside the fence line, he was already gone. Maybe he had cut through the yard for some reason. Except my backyard wasn't on the way to anything. You wouldn't accidentally run through it. Nothing missing. No explanation. When I went back inside and told my girlfriend, she wanted me to call the police. I didn't. I had no proof he'd done anything. All I knew was that I had seen him running through my yard. We ended up locking every door and forgetting about it as best we could. After that night, every strange thing he'd done before suddenly felt more significant. The staring, the watching. Whenever I got home from work, I'd glance toward his house. Whenever I heard something outside, I'd check. A few days later, I was taking trash bins to the curb and saw him standing beside his garage. The moment he saw me looking at him, he walked inside. That was around the point where I started considering moving. I didn't like living near somebody who made me uncomfortable every time I saw him. My girlfriend agreed. She hated when she arrived at the house and noticed him outside. She said she always felt like he was watching her car. A week after the backyard incident, I had worked late that evening and got home tired. My girlfriend wasn't there because she had an early shift the next morning and decided to stay at her apartment. Around 10 o'clock, I got up to grab a drink from the kitchen. As I walked down the hallway, I saw a light on. It was coming from the spare bedroom near the back of the house. I rounded the corner and saw someone standing inside. A man, wearing rubber gloves. And it took my brain a second to recognize that it was the neighbor. For a second, I thought I was looking at a burglar. He was standing near the closet with his hands down at his sides, wearing a pair of bright yellow rubber gloves like the kind people use for cleaning. He was standing there looking around the room. I asked him what the hell he was doing in my house. He turned toward me. He didn't seem surprised, just walked past me. I backed away because I didn't know what he was going to do. I kept yelling at him while following him toward the front door. He never answered a single question, not one. He opened the front door, stepped outside, and headed toward the street. Within seconds, he was gone. I called the police. They showed up and spoke with him. The basic outcome was that I ended up with more questions than answers. Nothing missing. That was one of the strangest parts. Nothing had been touched. The only thing I could say with certainty was that I had found my neighbor standing inside my spare bedroom wearing rubber gloves. My girlfriend started pushing much harder for me to move. She didn't even want to stay over anymore. The house no longer felt comfortable. A couple of weeks passed without anything happening. After that, one evening, I had just gotten home from work and was sitting near the front window eating takeout. The neighbor's car pulled into his driveway. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention. I saw what he was carrying. They were dolls. A whole bundle of them. Different sizes. Different styles. He had several tucked under one arm while carrying others by their bodies. The sight of it was bizarre enough that I stayed by the window watching. As he walked toward his house, I realized he was talking directly to the dolls. I could only see his mouth moving. Every few steps, he'd glance down toward them as if expecting a response. Then he'd continue talking. I remember feeling embarrassed for even watching because it seemed like I was spying on somebody who was clearly dealing with some kind of personal issue. At the same time, this wasn't just some random neighbor anymore. This was the same person who had been inside my house. He disappeared into his front door, carrying the dolls. That night, I told my girlfriend what I had seen. She looked unsettled. It's just difficult not to notice somebody after they've been caught inside your home. Nobody tried entering the house again. I'd wake up early before work and spot him standing outside. I'd come home and find him sitting in a chair facing the street. The expressions, I don't know how to explain those. He always looked like he was concentrating on something. And whenever I caught him looking toward my house, he'd continue looking for a few seconds before eventually turning away. Every conversation about the future eventually turned into a conversation about moving. Within a month, I had another place lined up. My girlfriend was relieved. My parents were relieved. Even friends who only knew part of the story thought it sounded like the right decision. On the final day, I loaded the last truck and walked through the house one final time to make sure nothing had been left behind. I mostly felt relieved. Maybe there are completely rational explanations for all of this. Maybe he was struggling with issues I couldn't understand. But out of everything that's happened to me, that remains the single creepiest living situation I've ever experienced because there was never any answer. I'm Jennifer. I never found an explanation that made me feel satisfied, and this memory sits in this strange category in my mind where every logical possibility seems incomplete. I was living with my parents. I had finished school, was working, and was trying to put enough away to eventually move out. Our house sat on a fairly large piece of property compared to most of the neighborhood. The backyard stretched farther than people expected when they first saw it, and near the rear property line, there was an enormous old tree that had probably been there longer than the house itself. I don't actually know what kind of tree it was. My dad knew, but I never paid attention when he talked about things like that. I just remember it being huge. The trunk was thick enough that two adults probably couldn't have wrapped their arms all the way around it. Some of the branches extended over part of the yard, and during the day it provided a lot of shade. At night it looked different. The thing became this giant dark shape against the sky. One evening I was outside by myself. It had been hot all day and the house felt stuffy even with the air conditioning running, so I took a folding lawn chair into the backyard after dinner. I had been sitting there for like 20 minutes and glanced toward the back of the yard. I assumed I was looking at part of the tree. After a few seconds I realized what I was seeing didn't seem connected to the tree. It's difficult to describe accurately. Whenever I've told people this story over the years, I always worry that it sounds more movie-like than it looked. A shape appeared darker than everything around it. The tree was already dark because it was nighttime. The shadows underneath it were dark too. But there was something positioned near the trunk that seemed darker than the surrounding darkness, if that makes any sense. I remember lowering my phone and staring. It seemed like a person standing there. There weren't any visible features. It was just a human-shaped silhouette. It looked almost cut out of black paper, and the figure seemed unusually tall. I'm careful about saying that because distance can distort perception at night. Something farther away can appear larger or smaller depending on lighting conditions. I stood up from the chair. As soon as I did, the shape seemed more obvious. The tree behind it wasn't moving much because there wasn't much wind. The figure still appeared completely motionless. I walked forward. I should have been able to identify a person if someone was standing there. The shape remained oddly featureless. No face, no clothing details, no visible skin. I think what really triggered the panic was realizing I couldn't identify what I was looking at, despite staring directly at it. The shape wasn't far enough away to be impossible to see. I should have been able to make out something. It looked almost like a void standing next to the tree. I backed up a couple of steps while still looking at it. The shape didn't move. Then I did something I'm still slightly embarrassed about. I screamed. The moment I heard my own voice, I turned and ran toward the house. My mother was in the kitchen. My dad went outside. He checked the yard. No person. Eventually everybody went to bed, and although I felt uneasy, I convinced myself I had misinterpreted shadows. That lasted about 2 days. I started avoiding the backyard. A few days later, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, and something happened that I had never experienced before. I woke up but couldn't move. That's how it felt. I became aware of my bedroom, aware of the darkness, aware that I was lying in bed, but my body felt completely locked in place. I tried moving my arms. I remember attempting to call for my parents even though I was an adult. It was pure instinct. I wanted somebody to come into the room and help, but I couldn't speak. The sensation only lasted a short time. Eventually, I was able to move again. I sat upright, breathing heavily, and turned on every light in the room. The experience terrified me. I had never heard the term sleep paralysis at that point. Nobody in my family talked about it. I thought something medical had happened. Unfortunately, that wasn't the last time it happened. Over the following weeks, I experienced it several more times. Sometimes there were days between episodes. Sometimes it happened twice in 1 week. The physical sensation was always similar. I'd become aware that I was in bed, but my body felt trapped. It wasn't just inability to move. It felt like some invisible pressure was holding me down. I know now that many people describe sleep paralysis that way, but at the time I didn't know that. I only knew it felt horrible. Then came the dream. It felt different from ordinary dreams. It had that strange, hyper-real quality some nightmares have where everything seems sharper than normal. I was looking at myself, not through a mirror. I was somehow seeing myself and recognizing that it was me. Something was terribly wrong with my face. The mouth was the first thing I noticed. It stretched far wider than a human mouth should. That's what makes it disturbing to remember. It looked almost believable, almost possible, like a human face distorted in a way that shouldn't exist. The lips were pulled into this enormous grin. My teeth looked really creepy, although I couldn't tell you why. And above my head, what appeared to be a human leg, positioned above me in a way that made no sense whatsoever. And throughout all of this, the version of me I was looking at was laughing continuously. It sounded familiar, which is what made it so disturbing. It sounded like my own voice. The version of me in the dream just kept laughing without stopping, while staring directly forward with that impossibly wide smile. The leg above her head didn't move. It was simply there, hanging at an angle that made no physical sense. The entire scene felt wrong in a way that's difficult to put into words because dreams are usually chaotic. But this, it felt strangely organized, like I was being shown something rather than dreaming it. I woke up gasping and immediately sat up. For a few seconds, I couldn't tell if I was awake. I kept touching my face because part of me still expected to feel that smile stretched across it. I turned on the bedside lamp and stayed awake until sunrise. I think that was the point where my anxiety started feeding itself. Before that nightmare, I had mostly been worried about the thing I saw near the tree. Afterward, I became worried about sleeping. That sounds funny to anyone who hasn't experienced recurring nightmares or sleep paralysis, but once you start associating sleep with fear, you begin dreading the moment you close your eyes. Every night became this little mental battle where I'd tell myself nothing was wrong. I'd eventually drift off, and then I'd wake up at 3 in the morning convinced something terrible had happened. The paralysis episodes continued. I'd wake up unable to move for a short period, panic, and then regain control of my body. Sometimes I'd see vague shapes in the darkness, but I later learned that's actually common during sleep paralysis. Your brain is partially dreaming while you're awake. Knowing the explanation didn't make it less frightening. One particular night stands out because I remember opening my eyes and seeing what looked like a person standing in the corner of my room. Even as it happened, I knew something wasn't right about what I was seeing. The shape seemed to shift whenever I focused on it. It wasn't clear and solid the way a real person would have been. Still, when you're unable to move and your body feels trapped, logic becomes harder to access. I remember staring at that corner until I regained movement. The second I sat up and turned on the light, there was nothing there. The strange thing is that I wasn't becoming more convinced something supernatural was happening. I was becoming more confused. The figure near the tree had happened while I was fully awake. The sleep paralysis episodes happened while I was asleep. My brain kept trying to connect the two events, even though I couldn't logically prove they were connected. My parents knew about the thing in the backyard, but I never described the nightmare in detail. A couple of close friends knew I was having trouble sleeping. That's about it. The only person I really talked to was my grandmother. My grandmother was a deeply religious woman. She wasn't the type who claimed every strange event was paranormal. In fact, she was usually the most practical person in the family. If a window slammed shut, she'd blame the wind before anything else. She became unusually quiet. She didn't react dramatically. She didn't start talking about demons or anything like that. She simply listened. I told her about seeing the figure near the tree and waking up unable to move and the dream. She said, "Well, whether it's your mind or something else, maybe it wouldn't hurt to spend some time at church." A week later I went. I hadn't attended regularly in years. I wasn't angry at religion. Life had just gotten busy. I was there specifically because a nightmare had frightened me. I ended up talking to someone afterward and explained that I'd been having recurring nightmares and trouble sleeping. I left out some details because I didn't want to sound crazy. Nobody told me evil spirits were following me. What mattered was that it made me feel like I was doing something. When people are scared by something they don't understand, sometimes taking action helps, even if the action doesn't directly solve the problem. Around that time, I started carrying a small cross. It wasn't because I suddenly became convinced something supernatural was happening. It was like a source of reassurance. The same way some people carry a lucky coin or keep a meaningful photograph in their wallet. The nightmares didn't disappear immediately, but over the following months they became less frequent. The sleep paralysis episodes also decreased. Years passed. The giant tree behind my parents' house was eventually removed after part of it became damaged during a storm. It felt strange. When I was younger, I constantly tried to solve it. The memory itself remains unusually vivid. I've forgotten entire years of ordinary life events. I've forgotten conversations, birthdays, addresses, passwords, and all kinds of things that should have been easier to remember. But I can still picture that shape near the tree perfectly. Decades later, I occasionally experience sleep paralysis. Most episodes are mild compared to what happened back then. I'll wake up, realize I can't move, panic for a moment, and then it passes. The interesting thing is that every single time it happens, no matter how much time has gone by, my mind immediately goes back to that period of my life. Back to that backyard, back to that tree, back to the shape standing there. Maybe seeing something strange that night genuinely scared me more than I realized, and everything afterward was the result of stress and sleep disturbances. But if that's true, I've never experienced another fear response quite like it before or since. I've been through objectively worse situations in my life. Serious illness in the family, accidents, financial problems, real things that deserved anxiety. None of them produced that specific sequence of events. None of them resulted in recurring paralysis and dreams that lingered for years in my memory. The cross I started carrying all those years ago is still with me. This happened when I was in college, during a drive back home with my aunt after visiting some relatives. My aunt and I had stayed later than everyone else because she got caught up talking with one of her cousins she hadn't seen in years. I wasn't driving because it was her car and she preferred driving at night herself. She always said she trusted her own reactions more than anybody else's, which wasn't an unreasonable attitude considering how many miles she put on that car every year. The route home took us through a lot of rural highway. I remember spending most of the drive scrolling through my phone and occasionally reading funny texts from friends to my aunt. She wasn't really paying attention to my stories, but every once in a while she'd laugh at the right moment and ask me to repeat something. At some point, she mentioned she was getting tired and wanted to stop somewhere for coffee. I wanted something to drink too, so we agreed to pull into the next place we found. About 15 minutes later, we saw one of those roadside rest stops that had a small convenience store attached to a gas station. A modest building with bright lights that seemed almost out of place, surrounded by darkness. There were a handful of vehicles scattered around, and what looked like a work van parked near the edge of the lot. My aunt parked close to the building. I told her I'd stay in the car for a minute because I was finishing a conversation on my phone. She said she'd go inside first and see if they had decent coffee. I remember making some joke about how every gas station coffee tasted the same. She rolled her eyes and went inside. The second she walked through the doors, I leaned my seat back a little and kept typing. I was looking down at my phone and I saw movement through the passenger side window. A man was walking toward the car. He stopped beside my window. I looked up. He appeared to be somewhere in his 40s. It's hard for me to judge now because this happened years ago and I was younger then. He wasn't dressed in a way that immediately drew attention. He was looking at me, staring. I remember feeling that little uncomfortable jolt people get when they realize a stranger is focused entirely on them. He motioned for me to roll down the window. I didn't. He gestured again. I cracked the window like an inch because I assumed he needed directions or wanted to ask something. The second I did, he stepped closer. "Are you alone?" he asked. The question immediately put me on edge. It felt wrong. Most people don't walk up to a stranger and start with that. I told him my aunt was inside. He looked toward the store and then back at me. "You waiting for her?" That was an odd follow-up because obviously I was. I just nodded. Then he asked where we were headed. At that point, I didn't answer. The conversation felt strange enough that every instinct I had was telling me to end it. I said, like, "She's coming back soon." Instead of leaving, he smiled. It looked forced, like somebody trying very hard to appear friendly. He asked if we were traveling far. Then he asked if we lived nearby. Then he asked another question I can't remember. What I do remember is realizing he wasn't asking for help. He wasn't making conversation naturally. He seemed interested in finding out information about me. I rolled the window up completely. I pretended to look back at my phone. He just stood there. Then he walked away. At least I thought he walked away. I couldn't see him. I grabbed my purse and headed into the store. My aunt was near the coffee machines trying to decide between two different flavors. I immediately walked over and stayed beside her. She noticed my expression right away. My aunt has always been one of those people who can tell when something is bothering somebody before they say anything. She asked what was wrong. I told her some guy had been asking me weird questions outside. Her first response was basically that he was just some lonely weirdo. I explained exactly what he'd asked. She didn't seem especially alarmed. Neither of us were. It was uncomfortable. That's all. We grabbed our drinks, a few snacks, and spent another several minutes inside. I remember seeing other customers coming and going. Eventually we checked out and headed back outside. The parking lot had also become quieter. A few vehicles that had been there earlier were gone. Our car was parked beneath one of the lights near the building. As we walked toward it, I was telling my aunt about something unrelated. Then, the same man was standing near our vehicle. He started walking directly toward us. He looked serious, just kept coming toward us. There was still enough distance between us that I wasn't immediately frightened, but every uncomfortable feeling I'd had earlier came rushing back. My aunt quietly asked, "Is that him?" I said yes. The man stopped several feet away. He reached into his jacket. I instantly thought something was wrong. Something was very wrong. When he pulled his hand back out, it was a gun. It was held low. He spoke. He looked directly at me. "Come with me." My aunt immediately stepped in front of me slightly and demanded to know what he was talking about. The man ignored her. His eyes stayed on me. He repeated himself. He gestured toward the road beyond the parking lot. I looked in that direction automatically. There was nothing there except darkness. I couldn't see a vehicle. I couldn't see anything at all. He told me to start walking. I remember freezing because my brain couldn't keep up with what was happening. It felt disconnected from reality. One minute we were buying coffee. The next minute a stranger was standing in a gas station parking lot with a gun telling me to go somewhere with him. My aunt started yelling. She told him to get away from us. She demanded to know what he thought he was doing. The man still barely acknowledged her. He took a step toward me. I was terrified. I started backing up. The man took another step toward me and lifted the gun. He still wasn't pointing it directly at my face, but it was obvious what he wanted. He wanted me moving in the direction he was indicating. I remember him saying something else, although I couldn't repeat it word for word now. It was along the lines of telling me not to make things difficult and to just walk with him. The strange thing was how controlled he sounded. There was no shouting. He spoke the way someone might speak while asking another person to move out of the way in a grocery store. My aunt completely lost her patience at that point. She stepped forward and started yelling louder than I had ever heard her yell before. She wasn't trying to negotiate with him. She was furious. She was demanding that he leave us alone, calling him every name she could think of, and drawing as much attention as possible. At the same time, I started screaming. The man kept glancing around the parking lot. Looking back, I think he expected me to panic quietly or freeze up. Instead, he suddenly had two people making an enormous amount of noise. The convenience store wasn't crowded, but there were people inside. My aunt saw that too. She started yelling even louder and waving her arms. The man took another step toward me. I took several steps backward. My aunt moved with me. The whole thing couldn't have lasted very long. What I remember, realizing that he seemed to be losing confidence. He kept looking around. The calm expression he'd had earlier was gone. People shouted from near the building. The man turned his head toward the sound. Then he looked back at us one final time. Then he suddenly turned and ran. I was crying. A couple of people from the store came outside asking what happened. I remember sitting inside the store while my aunt talked to employees. I had never seen him in my life. There was nothing distinctive enough to stand out. We left. I'm intentionally being vague about everything that happened afterward because there isn't much I can add. The questions he asked while I was sitting in the car suddenly looked very different in retrospect. They felt calculated. He had wanted to know if I was alone. He wanted to know who I was traveling with. He wanted information. I don't know whether he specifically chose me before approaching the vehicle or whether it was random. I don't know whether he had been watching the parking lot for a while. I don't know where his vehicle was parked, assuming he had one nearby. I never saw a vehicle that seemed connected to him. When he pointed toward the road, I automatically looked in that direction. There was nothing visible except darkness. The store wasn't large. The windows faced the parking lot. Yet neither of us remembered seeing him through the glass while we were shopping. That meant he could have been positioned somewhere outside our view. When my aunt first parked the car, I was thinking about text messages and snacks. 10 minutes later, I was convinced I might be taken somewhere against my will. That gap between normal life and genuine fear was incredibly small. If my aunt hadn't immediately started fighting back and making as much noise as possible, I have no idea where I would have ended up.